Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is going to be about express routing and just exploring sort of like what is routing at the end of the day. Okay, so at its simplest, well, first let's just start up an express project. So I'm going to make a new folder. I'll just do it from terminal. So we'll just say make dir, meaning make directory. We'll make a directory called, and again, I'm using bash. So bash comes natively on Mac and Linux. If you're using Windows, you would have to download a piece of software called git bash to use the bash terminal. But make dir, let's just call this routes and routers. Okay, I'll cd into routes and routers. I'm going to create a new npm project with npm init-y, which creates a new package.json. So we can see here, see there's my package.json, which is empty at the moment. I'm going to make a file, so touch server.js. I'm going to install some node packages, so let's install npm install express, because I'm only going to be dealing with express here. Cool. And there, see my node modules folder where everything gets installed. My package lock, which is just like a metadata on like how my libraries were installed in what order, and their sub libraries. So like if we were just to take a look at this real quick, see it says like routes and routers, and it lists not only express, which I installed, but it lists all the dependencies of express. And that's what you never really need to edit this file, but it's there to kind of help make future installs faster, because it's documenting like how everything got assembled, so that way it doesn't have to refigure it out if you reinstall everything. Package.json, this file just has all the information about my project. So I generally like using scripts, so I'm going to get rid of this test script, and I'm just going to do a dev script. Well, I'll just do a start script because I didn't install nodemon. So we'll just say node server.js. So essentially whenever I run this script, it runs this command. That's essentially what that's saying. So in this case, I can do npm run start and see it runs the command. It ran node server.js. Now, the cool thing about specifically the start command is the only one where I can do this. I can do npm start. I don't actually have to use the word run. For any other name of a script, then I always have to do like npm run, the script name. But for npm start, I can do this and see it does the same thing. So that's a neat little twist. Cool. So that's getting set up. So I have Express installed. I have my script installed. Now I just need to go to my server.js. Let's set up our basic Express boilerplate, which is you always have to, anything you want to use in this file that is from another file, either from a library or from another file you have to import. So I'm going to import my dependencies, meaning the things that this file depends on. Got to kind of treat each file in the node world, because again, we're using node.js to run our files. Because whenever you do JavaScript in the backend, you're either going to use node, or newer and not as popular is Deno. And Deno is awesome, but it's a different thing. It's got different rules. So this is specifically node. The way I import something is I'll just create a variable. So we'll say const express is the variable, and then I'll run this function called require. And require, when I put in the name of a library, so look, if I put in the name of a library like this require function will go into my node modules folder, find it, and then this function returns the exported library. Like that library exports something, usually an object with a bunch of functions and things, and that gets saved into this variable. Okay, now if I did something like this, like ./express, it's now not looking at a library, it's looking for a file called express.js. But it'll look at that file, see if anything is exported from it, and then return whatever is exported from that file and save it in this variable. Okay, that's what require does. It just, all require does, it returns the exported value from the desired library or file. That's all it does. Okay, so require, I'm just going to require express, so that'll return the express library and save it in this variable. And then the other thing you have to do is we have to create an application object. And the application object represents our application, represents all the things that go in when our server receives a request. So we're going to say const app equals express. Because this express express is actually a function, and when we run this function, it returns a instance of the application object. Okay, and that application object has everything we need to run an express application. And the last piece that's like a must-have is the listener. So we'll just call this starting the server. So basically what happens, we say, hey, application, we want you to listen. We want you to listen for requests. We'll say on port 3000 on our computer. And then we can pass in a function that just allows us to like do a message. So we'll just console.log listening on port 3000. We can put whatever we want. So now, technically, I've done everything you need to have your bare minimum express application. So npm run start, and say it's listening on port 3000. If I go to localhost, because localhost represents your local computer, and on my local computer I have a server running on port 3000. Okay, I get this. This is a good sign. This means that the server's running because this is a message from Express. This just means that, hey, I made a GET request, because whenever you type anything into the browser, that's always a request of type GET. Okay, and you can always see all the requests your browser is making in the DevTools under this tab, Network. So if I refresh the page, see, I can see the request to localhost 3000. And I can see the details of it. That, okay, we made a request to localhost 3000 of type GET, and we got back a 404 response, which means 404 always means, hey, we didn't find it. Okay? It doesn't exist. Because what happens is that when we send the request to our server, it's going to look through the application to see, hey, did I ever say how to handle a GET request? Did I ever say how to handle a GET request to this particular URL? And the path starts right after the 3000. So see, right now it's just slash, because that's what you see right here, slash. Because this is what's referred to as the host. So like the xyz.com, google.com, that's the host part of the URL. Then anything with a slash going forward is referred to as the endpoint or path. And generally, like, the server is going to determine how to respond based on the path and the verb. So a mixture of get, and in this case, just a slash. Okay, cool. And basically the way it works is that whenever there's a match, it runs a function. So I'm going to just create a function for every route, okay? So I'm going to just actually, let's see here, how do I want to do that? Actually, I'll just do it as a separate file, okay, just to show you that a function is just a function. So I'm going to create a new file. We'll just call it res.js. And I'm going to just make sure that every route has the same exact response, because I'm not here to talk about how the response is generated. I'm more to talk about how we write the routes. So it's just one. So I'm going to just do module.exports. I'm just going to export one single function out of here. And that function takes every middleware or route function always takes in 3 arguments. Generally, if it's like the route, meaning like it's the thing that's going to send a response, so it's the end of the chain of events, you only do rec and res, because you don't need next, because next assumes that you're going to do something else after. So generally that's why with routes you don't include the next, because that's the end of the story. Like, we're going to send the response. So I'm going to do, let's say, res.send, and I'm just going to send the rec. I think it's rec.url. So basically, we'll always just get back the URL. Actually, I'll make this a little bit more complicated. Res.json. So that way you're sending it back as JSON data. And I'm going to send back an object that has the URL. We'll grab that from the request, because the request has all the data on the request, the URL. I also want, let me think here. I want the host. I think that would just be rec.host. We'll find out. I think that's the case. And anything else I want to grab? Oh, method. The method. Rec.method. So see, because all the information about the request is inside the request object. What kind of URL is it? What kind of host is it? What method is? So I'm just going to use this one function for all my routes. So they're always just going to return the data about themselves, just to make life simple. So I'm going to import that function, const all res, meaning all response for all. So all response, when we require, because see, this file res.js exports, module.exports, this function. That's what it's exporting. So in that case, when I do the require here, what does the require return? That function. So that function will be stored in all res. So for require to work, whatever it's requiring has to export something. Okay, and don't mind the sounds in the background. I do live in Brooklyn, which, well, unfortunately is very loud. Okay, and since this is a file, I have to use a file path. So when I take a look at server.js, because that's the file I'm importing it in, I have to think, where does res.js exist relative to server.js? They're in the same folder, so then I can just do /res.js, because I'm describing where does the file I want to import exist relative to the file that I'm importing from. So that imports whatever is exported from res.js, saves it in this variable. Great. Now here's the thing. At the end of the day, like, everything in Express is middleware. At the end of the day, like, I could just do this. I could just say app.use. Now app.use, essentially everything that's like app.use, app.get, this is all, what you're really doing is you're just registering different types of middleware. And all that's happening is that Express is going to run the request through the middleware that you've registered, that you've linked to your application in the order that you've linked it. Okay? So I could just say app.use and just say all res. Now, notice I didn't say, hey, use this function for a particular like path or a particular verb. So this is gonna end up getting used for every request. And right now it's the only thing that's being used. Okay, that's it. So this technically would satisfy every possible route. So if I restart my server, because you do have to restart your server, because since I'm running the command using node, it doesn't automatically restart when I save changes, like if you use something like nodemon. So I need to make sure that the computer rereads the updated code, so I gotta rerun the command. npm run start. So now if I literally just type in any, like type in /cheese, I get this box. See, in the URL, so the path is /cheese. The host is localhost, because like I said, again, the host is this part of the URL, and the method is get. Okay, and if I type in like just gibberish, I get this response. Okay, so you don't have to use like app.get, app.put, app.whatever to send a response. You could theoretically do all your responses using app.use. You could just literally use app.use for everything. Just generally not the way you do things. Okay? But at the end of the day, my point being is that everything is just a middleware function. Okay, so literally this function I can use everywhere. So using it there, though, the result is going to be that I just send a blanket response to everything. So normally what you would do is you would create specific routes for specific paths with specific verbs. So the way you would do that here at the global level, so whenever we're using the app object, we're globally registering middleware. So we're saying, hey, this piece of middleware exists, you know, it's something you should check for every request. Okay, so if I do app.get, I'm saying, hey, for, you know, every get request that matches this URL, okay, and again, it's actually checking this URL property, so it's waiting for this to be just / because this has to match that. Okay, if that matches, then run whatever function is in the second slot. I could write a function right there, so I could just do something like this, rec res, because again, that's always a signature for these middleware functions. Okay, and just say res.send, yay. Okay, so now I'll restart the server. Okay, and now if I go back to /, yay. Why? Because the method was get, because again, whenever you make a request from the browser, it's always a get request. And basically, that was the path. So these two things matched, so that route happened. And I could theoretically literally write all my routes here in server.js. So I could do something like this. I could just be like app.get, and we'll use the path /cheese /1 and then it'll just use the all res function because to save time. So basically, and again, you can pre-write your functions in another file and then just plop them where that function is needed. So the bottom line is, it doesn't matter if you write the file in the route or into another file, long as this second argument is a function that meets the function signature, which means a function that ends in some sort of response, res.json, res.render, res.redirect, and is taking in the request and response object. So long as it's a function that meets that signature, you can just pass it in, and I could pass it in as a second argument. I could, you know, I could either just write the variable here with the function, or just write the whole function right there. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to write 3 routes. Okay, here, / cheese routes. Okay, Control C, and I'll just copy these because they're all going to have the same response. So this is just going to be 2. And then this will be 3. So now here, since I'm doing it globally, I have to kind of describe the whole path because nothing's assumed yet. At the app level, nothing has been assumed yet because it's not coming from anywhere else. So let's say I wanted to do like bread routes. Okay, I will copy the cheese routes and plop those there. And then let me just change these to bread. Cool. So there I have 6 routes defined. I can just literally do everything from that main file, server.js. I could do that. Let me restart my server. And now if I go to like /cheese1, see, I get this. And again, it's returning, I'm using that allRes function, which just returns the URL, the host, the method. But I never made a cheese4. I never defined that, so watch what I get. I get cannot get because I don't have a route that describes what happens when there's a get request to /cheese4. Okay, cool. Now here's the thing though, like this gets kind of messy because eventually you're gonna have lots and lots of routes in this file, and it gets kind of hard to keep track of. So what people will do is they'll use a router. Okay, they'll use a router. So what they'll do is they'll create another file. So we're gonna actually move both of these into their own router. Okay. And so I'm gonna create a new file. Okay, we'll call this, and I'm just gonna do this all at the top level. I'm not gonna use a bunch of folders. We'll just call this cheese router.js. And essentially what you do is you'll import express. Well, we'll create a router. So I'm gonna create a router object. And the way I do that is I will require express. Now I get the express object back, but instead of, I don't really need the express object. I just need to create a router real quick. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna immediately chain off of it, run the router function, which is part of express. That's the thing that creates a new router, and then the new router gets saved here. So that way I do it all in one line. So I'm just bringing in express for like a split second, running that router function, and then saving the resulting router in here, and then the express just disappears for the rest of that file. Okay, just a little bit, you know, less writing, a little bit more efficient. But now you have this router object. The way you have to think about this router object, it's like a mini app. Okay, Basic can do everything app can do in our server.js, except it doesn't have its own listener. So it can't do like router.listen. That's only app can do that. Okay. But essentially it can register its own routes, register its own middleware. So I can do like router.use, router.get, router.post. I can register its own like order of things to do. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my server.js. I'm going to copy over these, cut. Okay. And post those into my cheese router. And then instead of using app.get, I need to use router.get because that's the name of my router. Okay, because in here we call the router. But also this allRes function needs to be brought in because, again, just because I imported it in server.js doesn't mean it works here. Anything you use in any file has to be imported in that file. It only exists in that file if you've declared it in that file. So in that case, I got to go declare allRes. And then I'm going to say, equals require, and again, everything's in the same folder because I didn't use subfolders. So this will just be ./res.js, because relative to cheeserouter.js, res is in the same folder. So /. / always means the same folder. // means a folder above, and then I can just keep doing slashes to go into subfolders. Cool. And here's the thing: in order for me to use this router, like anything else, because I'm running server.js, whenever time I run npm run start, it's running server.js. So if a file isn't connected to server.js or connected to a file that is connected to server.js, it's not part of what's going on. Okay, everything's got to be connected somewhere. Okay, so you always start with like whatever file you're running and think about like, you know, these files are connected to my server.js. So when I run server.js, these files get brought in. Okay, so that means this cheese router's got to get connected. So module.exports. Okay, and I'll do module.exports, and we're going to export router. Because again, I'm registering all these routes with router. So this router object has all the routes built into it. Every time I do this like get function or post or put, you know, router.get, router.put, what I'm doing is I'm registering another route with that router object. And that router object is building a list of all these routes internally. So I export the router into server.js. So, I mean, I export it, and now I'm going to import it. So I go into my server.js, and I'm going to say, hey, I want the cheese router. And it doesn't matter what you call it, okay? The variable. Because require just takes the value of what's exported. So I could call that just the letter C if I wanted to. But then I have to I have to make sure I point the require function to the right file. So in this case, again, it's all in the same folder. So I'm pointing it to cheese router. Oops. Cheese router. So I've imported cheese router. So now cheese router exists in server.js. So it's now connected, but it doesn't do anything. I never actually used it. So I have to register it with my application. I have to register this router with my application. And usually you treat the routers like middleware. So you do them, you generally register them before the rest of your routes. So middleware. So I'll say app.use, okay, cheese router. Now if I do this, it's just kind of like I wrote more routes. It'll just always send the request to the cheese router to see if it matches, which is fine. But usually you create the routers because you don't want every request to have to be checked against every route, because that's slow. You know, imagine someone taking every time someone walks into the club, that person checks that person's name against every name on the guest list. Instead of just like briskly looking for the name, they literally just like compare each two names one by one. It would take forever. What would be simpler is if you had like a bunch of different smaller lists, like a list for names that start with A, a list with names that start with B. So then when someone says, hey, I'm Alex, I'm on the list, they just look at the list of people that start with A, which is a smaller list than looking at all the names. So we can kind of do that. So we can say, hey, only use cheese router when the request is making a request to a URL that starts with /cheese. Okay, so that way you only use the cheese router when that's the way the URL starts. Now this creates a little bit of a wrinkle. Okay, so let me restart the server. Now if I go to /cheese/1, it should break. But he's like, wait a second, /cheese/1, can I get /cheese/1? But wait a second, if I go to my cheese router, there's /cheese/1. So why doesn't that work? Well, the reason is, since the router, which is registered here, I already said /cheese here, that's assumed. So now it's assuming that /cheese has already happened. So now it's comparing anything after /cheese. So technically now /cheese1 has become /cheese/cheese/1. And see, there it is. Okay? Because basically when we did app.use, we compared this part, and then the router compared this part. Okay, so we got to be careful how you set up your routers, so that way, you know, you don't accidentally compound your identifier. So technically, to make this work the way I want, I got to delete these cheeses now, because the /cheese is right here, and then I can define the remainder of the URL here. Okay, cool. But the nice thing is now, if let's say I do a bread URL, let's say I do a URL that starts with /bread, when it's going through the list of things, it goes here. If it doesn't start with /cheese, it just skips the router entirely and starts going to these. Before, it was actually checking it against each individual cheese route one by one, which is less efficient. So the nice thing about having routers is that you're able to kind of create bundles of routes that are related, that you can be like, hey, you know what? If you don't start with this, then just skip this bundle, okay? Instead of having to check each one individually. So it makes your code more organized, but it also ends up making your Express application faster, because you're able to skip chunks of checks. You're able to skip chunks of checks without having to do that, okay, with etc. And then and the thing is that this is just middleware. So this whole app.use thing, so you can link routers within routers. So here I'm linking this router globally. So anytime I use app.use, I'm linking the middleware globally. It's going to be sort of in the global routine that every request goes to. I could also create middleware on the router. So the router can have its own middleware, which could be another router. So I could link another router to the router. Okay, so I can be like router.use, and I'm not going to make another router, but I can make a quick piece of middleware. So I'll be like rec.res.next, and okay, say, hey, this is res.send, or we'll actually just say rec dot, we'll make up a little thing called rec.message equals middleware 1 happened. Okay, and I'm going to add that to my response. I'm going to go up to my res.json and just add that to the things that we print out. So message equals rec.message, because now I know that property is going to exist because this middleware is going to run before any of these routes happen. Okay, so this thing will have happened, and then I want to make sure that it goes on to the next piece of middleware, so I put next. So when I do a cheese request, it'll go into this router, this middleware will run first, and then it'll go check against these get routes. Okay, let's test that out. So let me restart my server. So now that I've kind of fixed this up, I should be able to go to /cheese/1 now and see middleware 1 happened. See, the only reason that message shows up is because that middleware I created, but only happens with that router. So if I go to bread/1, see, there is no rec.message because that middleware only runs for the cheese router. So that message only got added for the cheese router routes. Okay, and on top of that, I could even create route level middleware. So right here, before all res runs, I could actually create, I could just literally write another function, rec res next, and then just make sure I put a comma after the function, because you can create as many, you can literally pass in as many functions after the path as you want, and long as it's like they say next, 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 until you get to the last one, that's fine. So then I can do another one here. I can just do rec.message2 equals the route middleware was run. So you can actually do middleware that only runs for specific routes, which is really cool. Okay, and then I have to make sure I do next because that's got to go on to the next middleware. Let me just change the response so that way it also includes message2, rec.message2. And then we put a comma here. Cool. And this should be message2. Control C, let's restart the server. So, okay, again, if I go to bread, there should be no message because all those additional pieces of middleware were on the router and route level. But if I go to cheese/2, I should get the message because anything in the cheese router gets the message. But specifically, the route for cheese 1 had the extra route level middleware. So I should also get a message 2. So let me hit enter there. And see I get the message 2. Because I created a piece of middleware that runs specifically for that individual route. Okay, this is typically how you handle like auth. You'll create like an auth middleware function, and you slap it on the routes you want to protect. So that way you can literally tailor which routes get the protection. But essentially what happens is that whenever the request matches get and smashes /cheese/1, what it'll do is first run this function, and when this function says next, it then goes on to this function, and then that sends the response. Okay, so hopefully that makes like the chain of events when routing happens. At the end of the day, like, it all starts in server.js. So if you want to know what happens when something goes to your server, you start at server.js and you just kind of read down. You'd be like, anything, you start reading down everything after you create the application object. So what happens when a request comes in? First, Express is going to check, hey, does the thing slash with /cheese? If it does start with /cheese, it sends it down to the cheese router for further handling. If it doesn't, it skips that, and then it checks it against all these routes one by one. Okay, and then if it doesn't match those, it keeps going down. And if there's nothing else to check, there's no more app.gets, there's no more app.uses, it then returns that whole cannot get, cannot post, cannot put error, because it could not find a way to respond. And that's literally what happens every time a request goes to your Express app over and over again. That's literally Express in a nutshell. Like, that's what Express does. I mean, again, there's the URL params, the rec queries, and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, all Express is, and pretty much all backend web frameworks are, is that you're just creating a chain of middleware functions that run when a request comes in until a response gets sent. That's it. It's just you're creating a chain of events. You're just saying, run this function first, run this function second, run this function third, and it just keeps going down the list until a response gets sent. Once a response is sent, meaning like res.json, res.render, that's when the chain stops. It stops going forward at that point. So hopefully this helps make routing in Express a little clearer on how it works, on why it works. And my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com.